Hey, welcome to Dividing Decimals by Decimals. This is Mr. Dolphin, and this is Math 6. So let's discuss some vocabulary on the left-hand side of our notes. If you remember from yesterday, quotient meant the answer to a division problem. The word dividend was the number being divided by another number. And we talked about that being our in. And the last vocabulary word is divisor. That is the number you divide by. And let us think of that as our out. So we've got in and out. The dividend would be our in, and our divisor would be our out. Alright, so on the left-hand side, let's talk about some of the key concepts. Alright, so the first thing is whenever you are dividing by decimals, make the divisor into a whole number. Once you do that, you can move the decimal in the dividend the same amount of spaces. And then finally, just make sure you are annexing zeros as placeholders. So let me give you an example of what all of these words above here mean. If, for example, I have a dividend of 75 and 2/10, and once again it goes inside, that's the dividend. Then I would take my divisor and place it on the outside. Now the first part says I want to make sure my divisor is a whole number. So 4 3/10 is not a whole number, but I can make it look like a whole number by taking my decimal and moving it one space to the right. So now instead of saying 4.3, I can say 43. Now if I move the decimal in the divisor one space, I need to make sure I do that same exact thing to the dividend. So I'm going to move it one space behind as well. So instead of saying 75 and 2/10, I now have 752, and your decimal would be behind it. And just make sure you always bring your decimal up. So we're going to use these concepts to solve the following problems. Okay, so let's work with example 1. Example 1 says 1 and 71/100 divided by 9/10. So let's go ahead and estimate. This would be my in. This would be my out. So let's look at 1 and 71/100. If I round that to the nearest whole dollar, I think I get about $2 for that one. And if I round 9/10, that's close to 90 cents. 90 cents is close to $1, so let's divide. 1 goes into 2 twice. So my answer is approximately close to 2. Now if we think back to the key concept notes, I'm going to go ahead and rewrite these numbers. Not in the grid yet, but I want to go ahead and write the divisor on the outside and the dividend on the inside. And they told me that I need to make sure that I have a whole number as my divisor. So 90 cents or 9/10 is not a whole number, so I need to make sure I take my decimal and I move it one space behind. Now if I need to make sure I do that to my inside or my dividend as well, so take that decimal and move it one space behind as well. And I would just move it up. Now in the grid I want to go ahead and rewrite it so it's nice and clean. So my new divisor is 9 and my new dividend becomes 17 and 1/10. And what I want to do is I just want to bring up the decimal automatically so I do not forget about it. So all we do now is divide. Let's ask ourselves how many times does 9 go into 1? Well, it can't. Ask ourselves how many times does 9 go into 17? And that goes in once. So that becomes 9. We need to subtract and borrow. So 17 minus 9 becomes 8. And let's drop down our 1. 9 goes into 81 9 times, and that becomes 81. And when we subtract, we're left with 0. So our answer is equal to 1 and 9/10, which is approximately close to our estimate of 2. So we know our answer is reasonable. So let's go ahead and pause the video, complete these got it problems, and then play it back to get some feedback. Here's example 3. It says find 52 divided by 4/10. So once again, I know that 52 would be my dividend, so that becomes my in, and 4/10 is my divisor, that becomes my out. So I'm going to go ahead and write it here. 4/10 goes on the outside, and 52 goes on the inside. Let's make sure that our divisor is a whole number. So I'm going to take 4/10 and move my decimal one space behind. Now if you look at my 52 or my dividend, it doesn't have a decimal, but I can make it have a decimal by putting a decimal at the end. Now if I move one space in my divisor, I need to also make sure I move one space in my dividend, and in that empty spot I would put a 0. And let's move up that decimal, so the decimal becomes right there. So in my grid, I'm going to rewrite my problem. Becomes 4 on the outside, and on the inside, I've got 520. Now we can sit here and divide. 4 goes into 5 once, and that becomes 4. Subtract 1, and let's drop down to 2. 4 goes into 12 3 times, and that becomes 12. Subtract, drop down to 0. 4 goes into 0 times, and I'm left with 0. So my final answer is 130. And if you wanted to include the decimal, you would know that the decimal would go behind the 0, and we would just bring it right up. And that would be my answer. Here's example 4. I'm going to look at this problem, and this first number, this becomes my dividend, or my in, and 18/100ths becomes my out. And when I write it, I'm going to put the number on the outside, 18/100ths. Take the number on the inside. Let's write that inside. So my key concepts told me to make sure that my divisor is a whole number. So I'm going to take this decimal right here and move it 2 spaces to the right. So now it becomes 18. So if I move it 2 spaces to the right on the outside, I'm going to do that same exact thing on the inside. Move it 2 spaces over to the right. So my decimal goes right in front of the 9. So I want to make sure I bring it right up. So I'm going to go ahead and divide. So let's go ahead and rewrite these numbers inside of the grid so where it's nice and clean. So on the outside, I've got 18. And on the inside, I've got 0.9, and just for this case you can add zeros or annex zeros behind it and it doesn't change the value. And let's go ahead and add our decimal right into the top. Alright, so 18 cannot go into 0, so I'm going to put an X here. 18 can't go into 9, so let's put another X here, or you can put a 0. But 18 can go into 90, and I think if I do 18 times 5, that becomes 40, and 9 plus 4 is 90. So that goes in 5 times. That's a 90. Subtract, and I'm left with nothing. So my answer would be 5/100ths. So go ahead and pause the video, complete these got it problems, and then play it back for some feedback. So now that you've completed the lesson on dividing decimals by decimals, go ahead and self-assess yourself. Please write down and bring to class any questions you may have, and we can go over them tomorrow in class.